It's Monday, the 16th of January. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Scott Benton, Labour MP Olivia Blake, Guardian columnist Raphael Behr and Executive Editor of Unheard, Freddie Sayers. On the programme today,
I think it will be using trans people, already one of the most vulnerable, stigmatised groups in our society, as a political weapon.
I think the government has been very careful about how we talk about this. Look, there are conflicting rights here.
Will the government block a Scottish law that makes it easier for people to change gender? This is what Keir Starmer said in this studio 3 years ago.
So university tuition fees being scrapped will be in a Starmer manifesto.
Yes, that's why it's
the next election.
Is he about to do a U-turn?
You are no longer promising that you would get rid of tuition fees. That's clear from what you've said.
No, we're looking at the options, Laura. We haven't got a settled view on it.
So you're not promising you'd get rid of them.
No new oil! No new oil!
And is new legislation needed to prevent protests like this? Let's start with the online safety bill, because there's real political disagreement about whether the bill should make tech firm bosses criminally liable if their platforms contribute to the serious harm, abuse or death of a child. In its current form, tech firms would face higher fines only. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. Prosecute tech chiefs who endanger children, says Molly Russell's father. Ian Russell says inquest into daughter's death is a unique opportunity to make online platforms safer. Is he right, Scott?
I think he is. What I would start by saying is this online safety bill has been a long time in the making.
It certainly has.
Far too long. I think we're now broadly in a position where both parties are on a similar page. There's nothing more important than protecting our young people. There's a raft of measures in the online safety bill which endeavour to achieve this, but crucially protect free speech at the same time. There are a number of Conservative colleagues, myself included, who think it would be advantageous if we put high legal thresholds on firms. The 10% fine of turnover, which is in the bill at the moment, is good, but I think it needs strengthening, and I hope the government will listen to some of those arguments.
Do you agree with Scott and Ian Russell on this?
I think the problem is clearly there, and it's right to take it seriously. But we've got to remember the background, which is that for example, the last 3 years of pandemic, we have seen social media companies actively censoring distinguished professors, scientists, journalists for saying things that they decided were misinformation. This happened regularly, and often those exact same ideas proved to be true later in the day. So I think in reality, there's a tilt, if you're an executive at a social media company, towards safety, towards going further even than you're asked to by the government. And that's what happens in practice. So I do think we need to be cognizant of the opposite danger here, which is that we sleepwalk into a much more censorious kind of society. So the Miriam Cates amendment, I think...
The Conservative MP.
The Conservative MP, understand the impulse behind it, but prosecuting personally executives, it's a new territory.
I think most people would probably intuitively recognise there's a difference between contentious political content and material that could induce a child to harm themselves. You know, so that in terms of the nature of the content, clearly those are quite different things, and it should be possible to conceive of a regulatory regime that says, well, you know, having a good old argument about politics, clearly that shouldn't be censored if you have a society that recognises free speech. Having a product that shares information or facilitates the spread of information that harms children, that can easily be against the law. And the problem that you have here, well, first of all, as Scott implied or indicated, you know, you have this bill that's sort of pulling, it's all in one bill and it's pulling in different directions because it's trying to regulate content and guarantee free speech while regulating the content. And ultimately, this comes down to a much bigger question, which is whether the people who design these technological platforms are actually responsible for the content. And when they built them, they said, we just make the tools. You know, we're not responsible for what's being published here. But actually, their business model is very much the content, and it is what's being published. So, you know, I wish I knew the answer to this, but I think it's very hard. And I can see why actually saying you are criminally liable for this as the boss of the company that produces it, you could end up having an unenforceable and therefore quite a bad law at the end of it.
I'll just give one little example, which is there was a recent example of Conservative Woman, which is a publication which most people wouldn't think is very dangerous, which got hidden from certain mobile phone networks because it was decreed as adult content. And I think some things like that are very likely to happen if we go too far on this.
But the bill would give Ofcom the capacity to say what it, to actually define some of the nature of that content. So in theory, that exact scenario wouldn't happen if you had the full regulatory framework that the bill sort of envisages, but ultimately that gives Ofcom this extraordinary power. So it's such a horrible labyrinth.
And they would be the ones responsible for defining it, as you say. Where are you, Olivia?
Well, I think this has taken far too long, and that there has been so many people who have been at the worst end of this. And we know that there has been suicides, and people have been able to look up information that shouldn't really be freely available to young children. And I think that we have waited far too long for something that just isn't as substantial, which was first tabled. And I think that the Labour Party would be bringing forward a new bill if we were to get elected to actually put on offer what was originally intended by this bill, which is much more around protecting people, actually protecting consumers as well, but also respecting free speech.
But you agree with the amendment, you agree with Scott Benton in terms of having a higher threshold, making tech bosses criminally liable in this instance?
I think we've seen across lots of different sectors how fines can work to a certain extent, but they're not necessarily going to change behaviour. Some people will accept the fine. So I think the issue of criminality is an interesting one to discuss and debate, and certainly one that might change behaviours quicker than fines alone.
All right, we'll move on. Let me just show you this headline in the Financial Times. Rishi Sunak to block Scottish transgender bill using constitutional nuclear option. Now, this is a story that the Prime Minister has received legal advice that the bill passed by the Scottish Parliament to make it easier for people to change their gender cuts across UK legislation on equalities, which is a reserved matter for Westminster. So they are set to clash over this particular issue. Let's see how the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, reacted to that in a press conference today.
There are no grounds to challenge this legislation. It is within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. It doesn't affect the operation of the Equality Act, and it was passed by an overwhelming majority of the Scottish Parliament after very lengthy and very intense scrutiny by MSPs of all parties represented in the Parliament. So if there is a decision to challenge, then in my view it will be quite simply a political decision, and I think it will be using trans people, already one of the most vulnerable, stigmatised groups in our society, as a political weapon, and I think that will be unconscionable and indefensible and really quite disgraceful.
Now, we asked the Scottish Government or someone from the SNP to come onto the programme today, but no one was available. But I'm delighted to say Scotland political reporter is available, Andrew Kerr, and joins us now. Andrew, she sounds quite cross, Nicola Sturgeon. What else did she say?
Yes, she is really cross about this, Jo. We have been here before, haven't we? We covered the very febrile and torrid debate as this bill passed through the Scottish Parliament just before Christmas, and many people thought that had been then perhaps put to bed at that point. But of course, not now, of course, with the UK government threatening to block this. So Nicola Sturgeon is really pretty angry and using that phrase, the UK government perhaps using trans people as a political weapon, she was saying, in this debate, almost as a kind of wedge issue, isn't it? Because, of course, the SNP are split on this. Labour in Scotland and the UK are split on this as well. So for the Conservatives, pretty useful to perhaps use this as a wedge issue, but also perhaps genuine concerns too from the UK government about the impact of this legislation UK-wide.
Right. I mean, it's called a Section 35. That is what the UK government could use to try and block the law that's been passed. What's the Scottish government intending to do?
Yes, it sounds very technical, doesn't it? This goes back to the 1998 Scotland Act, which set up the devolved settlement here in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament opening in 1999. And of course, all parties really agreeing to that. You'll remember after the 1997 devolution referendum at that point, including Alex Salmond, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, then seeing the Scotland Act through. But it has never been used in almost, as Nicola Sturgeon was pointing out, a quarter of a century of devolved government. So if the UK government decides to block this, there can be a 4-week block. It prevents the bill going for royal assent to the King to be signed off, to be put into law. The Scottish Government can then, I suppose, institute their own legal action, I think, here in the Scottish courts. And then, of course, Jo, I think ultimately that would go up to the Supreme Court once again. So, yes, indeed, once again, we would all be back at the Supreme Court.
Scotland political correspondent Andrew Kerr, thank you very much for joining us. Is the UK government doing the right thing here? Are they using it as a political weapon in the way that Nicola Sturgeon said?
We're not at all. In fact, I think Nicola Sturgeon's words there are dangerous and inflammatory. The UK government is well within its rights to take these measures. The bill passed in Scotland will have profound impacts upon equality law across the rest of the United Kingdom. For example, a biologically male Scottish prisoner in an English prison could potentially change their gender and be asked to be moved to a woman's prison. Also, women's only spaces in England could be impacted upon this by biologically Scottish male who wanted, for example, to enter a women's refuge. This is very dangerous. I think the legislation is poorly thought through and the UK government are well within their rights to take this step.
You're raising your eyebrows there.
Yeah, I just think that's utter nonsense. This is once again trans people being used as political football. You know, the Labour Party put an amendment to the bill going through Scotland at the moment to make it exceedingly clear that this would have no impact on the equality laws and legislation in this country. And it's just misguided and again, stirring up hate. You know, we're talking about 0.2% of the population here. And actually, they've been treated with such disrespect throughout this whole debate. And I think really what the government needs to be doing is listening to their own review of GRA, their own consultation, and bringing forward legislation that aligns the UK and makes this a more humane process for people seeking a GRC.
I mean, of course, the Conservatives under previous governments did look at making it easier to change your gender in the way the Scottish Parliament has passed the law there. What would be wrong with that?
If I can just go back to Olivia's argument, this isn't stirring up hate at all. I think we have to, as politicians, we have a duty to cool this debate, and using language which is inflammatory isn't helpful to anyone in society, let alone trans people, when we're trying to be inclusive. The arguments I've put forward and the scenarios about protecting women's only spaces, not a single person in the SNP or the Labour Party who support this legislation have come up with a good argument to refute the concerns which I and other Conservative colleagues have expressed. That's the problem here. The safety of women is paramount, I'm afraid.
Undermine the Equality Act. How is that not a safeguard? How is that us not thinking about this in the round? Can you explain that to me? Because those things that you're raising just aren't true about this.
There are a number of legal experts who suggest that the legislation you're proposing wouldn't actually be able to come into effect because of the difference in this constitutional issue between reserved powers for Westminster and Scottish legislation. I'm afraid the legislation you are alluding to would not have the impact you were seeking.
Which is exactly why we need to see the UK government taking responsibility here and bringing forward reforms to the GRA, which is exactly what the Labour Party would do. Right, it is complicated.
I'm afraid this is an issue, Olivia, where you are badly out of touch with the British people.
I think you're actually wrong, and I think you're actually wrong on that, and I think that the polling shows that you're wrong on that.
Well, speaking of polling, I can give a little bit of a scoop to Politics Live here.
Oh, marvellous.
Unheard has actually done one of the largest polls of its kind on this issue, over 10,000 respondents around the UK, and the results will be coming out in the coming weeks. But the results aren't exactly what you'd expect, because right now, I bet in Sturgeon's office, the talk is, although there's a lot of public outrage, how this might advantage the SNP, it might advantage the constitutional question. But in fact, when you look at the numbers and you look by constituency, some of the constituencies where there's most concern about gender ideology and people are most worried about this whole notion of transitioning so early are in Scotland. So I think the politics of it aren't exactly what you'd expect, and it could play the other way for the Sturgeon operation.
We haven't got the SNP here, of course, but taking that argument on a little bit more, Raphael, how do you see it with the UK government poised to try and use this Section 35, the first time in its history, over this particular issue?
It's this particular issue that makes it so toxic, because actually, I think broadly speaking, there is, if you try and find some area of sort of moral consensus on the underlying issue, I think most people think that trans people at some point have a right to be recognised in law under the gender that they feel is their natural rightful gender, and then you have another set of complicated arguments about whether 16 is too young and how you express that in law, and then the exceptions that Scott raised, which open another whole contentious set of arguments. And then separately, you then crashing into that have this constitutional argument, which is whether actually Holyrood, a law that's passed in Scotland, Scotland has taken some choices legally regarding those issues, and those are now Scottish law, and then whether actually, I think that does cut across UK law, so there is a friction, the tectonic plates of kind of UK constitutional law, Scottish law, are rubbing, and unfortunately, you can have a situation where the Conservative government is right about the constitutional point of principle, and the fact that this Section 35 order doesn't get used very often doesn't mean it can't ever be used. So maybe this is one of the occasions when it does have to be used, but unfortunately, the earthquake, the sort of the seismic point where it's happening, is this incredibly sort of pugnacious, toxic cultural issue. And then the question is, has that been chosen deliberately to have a fight, or is it just unfortunate that this is happening on this one particular sort of culture war front line? And I'm not sure, but I suspect there's some choice has gone into that on both sides.
Where are you then, Scott, on what Raphael's just said?
I agree with a great deal of what you've just said. The constitutional, legal, cultural implications all colliding into one. It's going to be very, very difficult to pick out some of the varying pieces, but I have a great deal of sympathy with what Freddie said, actually, in terms of this potentially backfiring badly on the SNP government in Scotland. If I were in favour of Scottish independence, this would be the very last issue I would want to clash with Westminster.
They're not here,
on.
And equally, or if not equally, it could go the other way. It could, of course, turn some Scottish voters into thinking this was passed by Holyrood, by Scottish Parliament, and it should stand.
It could. It's just this issue has really shifted in the past couple of years. It's important to realise that we've accidentally hit upon it. But where we were 2 years ago, which is almost everyone thinking that this was the setup with gender ideology was virtuous and moral, a lot of people are a little bit more angry.
Well, question accidentally there. I mean, it is, if what you say is true, and the polling suggests it is, and that politically the balance has shifted, that would give the Conservative government an incentive to choose exactly this fight and to deliberately conflate a culture war battle with a constitutional one. And that would actually be quite a disingenuous thing to be doing.
And you agree with that?
And yeah, I think it, the way that this debate rears its ugly head would swing people's opinions against trans people because of the nature and the tropes that have been used against various communities over hundreds of years are the same against trans people. And I think that we've got to remember that transphobic hate crime has gone through the roof over the last few years. That is a direct correlation to the political debates that have been going on around these people's rights to exist, which I think is fundamentally
Well, let's hear from the transgender barrister whom we had on Politics Live last week, Robin White. She supports the gender recognition bill that's been passed, reform bill, I should say, in Scotland. Let's take a listen.
Trans people know who they are. And I suspect that I support the compromise period of a short period of months because it's a very important change in someone's life, a very significant change that someone needs to make. And it's not a change that should be entered into lightly. And the Scottish arrangements obviously involve a statutory declaration, which is a very significant public statement, public legal statement. And that isn't entered into by anybody lightly.
Robin White there talking about one of the reforms, which is cutting the length of time a trans person has to live in their acquired gender from 2 years to 3 months. Yesterday, though, interestingly, Olivia, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, addressed another change, saying that 16 and 17-year-olds are too young to legally make that decision. You can see that headline in the Times. Is he right?
I mean, the Labour Party, again, put down an amendment to bring it in line with our policy nationally, which is 18, which fits with the current legislation that we have in the UK.
So you do agree with Keir Starmer on this and disagree with the bill?
That is a change. That is a difference in the Labour Party policy than the Scottish policy. But obviously Labour politicians did support the bill overall in Scotland.
Right.
And I think that, you know, that's kind of a question that needs to be debated more, and which is why I would welcome a much broader kind of UK-wide debate on this, rather than us having a knee-jerk reaction to Scottish.
Right, well, you want to debate, but Keir Starmer's obviously made up his mind on this, as you say, in conflict with the Scottish Labour Party. I mean, there's a problem
there. Not in conflict, because we put forward a motion.
Well, but they broadly supported it even with the amendment there.
Yeah, because I think, you know, with these things, it's better to support something that's imperfect than not, and be seen to be against trans people, I think, personally. And I think that that's a debate that we'll have to have, and we'll have to go on the basis of evidence on this and listen to the experts on this, which I am certainly not, Jo. And I think that that's what we need to be guided by when developing policy around this.
Would that be a problem, potentially? Is it a problem, that difference?
I think this is going to be a very problematic issue for the Labour Party just in the future, just precisely because it is a culture war front line, and there are people who feel very, very passionately on either side of it, and the issues that were been raised in terms of not just the practical question of 16 to 18, but women-only spaces, women in sport. There are all sorts of areas where it could just become fissile, and the Labour Party will not be able to paper over the cracks.
I mean, it's more than a culture war, though. It's about people's health. It's about making potentially irreversible changes to bodies. It's a serious issue, and people are right to feel strongly about it.
And protecting women primarily as well, which is not very often heard in this argument, unfortunately.
Well, certainly we heard from all voices, I have to say, when we discussed this last week.
And Jo, in the debate in Scotland, it was very clear that women do not want their abuse to be used as a stick to beat trans people. And, Women's Aid Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, all came out in support of the changes that were going on up there. And that's true whenever we have this debate and any questions being put to women in the broader sense. There are people who fully support this change and who are women. And I think just using male violence against women as a stick to beat trans people is just unacceptable.
All right. And as I said earlier, we asked the SNP and the Scottish Government for an interview, but no one was available. Let's have a listen to something Keir Starmer said yesterday in his interview with Laura Kunsberg on the BBC.
You promised that you would scrap tuition fees. Now, does that promise stand?
Well, look, I think the tuition fee system needs to be changed. I don't think it's working. I don't think anybody would say it's working. But looking at the damage that's been done to the economy, Rachel Reeves and I have had to be very clear that we will only make commitments that we can afford at the next general election. So we need to look at that promise again.
As things stand, you are no longer promising that you would get rid of tuition fees. That's clear from what you've said.
No, we're looking at the options, Laura. We haven't got a settled view on it.
Okay.
What I won't do is make commitments that we can't keep, given the damage that's been done to the economy.
What Keir Starmer said yesterday. Let's have a listen to what he said on this particular issue 3 years ago.
What about university tuition fees, then? Will you remain committed to scrapping them in your first term?
They're all pledges, Andrew, so the answer to these questions is yes.
So university tuition fees being scrapped will be in a Starmer manifesto?
Yes, that's why it's
the next election.
Olivia, are you happy with what looks like Keir Starmer breaking that pledge on tuition fees?
Well, I don't think that's what was said at all. I think that we need to see massive reform.
He said it is an option.
And absolutely, it is an option, and a lot has happened in 3 years. And I for one, have a partner who works in the university sector, and we've seen, I was one of the people protesting against the introduction of the tripling of the fees, and we were told at that time quite clearly that no one would pay the top rate of fees, that there would be more choice, the commercialisation of universities would be fantastic. And what have we seen? Everyone paying that higher top rate of fee, and also the choice for students going down with courses closing up and down the country.
And that will continue under Keir Starmer, it looks like, if he wins the next election.
I don't think that's what he's saying. He's saying that reform needs to happen, and we need to have the debate around what that would best look like. Just look over the pond at America and, Biden and what he's been doing with graduates in terms of allowing them to give up some of their debt. I think there's bigger questions around this and how this can continue and how we can actually make sure that our universities are at the cutting edge of research.
Listening to that, do you think he's going to stick to his promise to scrap tuition fees?
Well, I think Labour Party policy at the moment is quite clear that we are scrapping tuition fees, but we do have to have that debate as we go into the next manifesto.
Will you be disappointed if he scraps?
Well,
if he doesn't scrap tuition fees?
I personally will be making the case very clearly that we shouldn't have fees and that we should also be looking at the structure of our university system as it stands, because it is actually not currently delivering on what it should be.
Is Keir Starmer going to break that pledge?
I think he probably will at some point. Look, if essentially the wider position that Keir Starmer has adopted is that, he said, he won't essentially be writing all sorts of blank cheques for all sorts of things. So he's accepted that there are serious fiscal constraints. And then the question becomes, well, if you're looking for a pot of money that you are going to spend, what are you going to spend it on? And so he's going to have to look at all the pledges that were made when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, because Jeremy Corbyn did not recognise those fiscal constraints. So clearly that manifesto is dead, and a lot of those pledges are not going to be repeated. Now, I think in terms of the wider politics of it, probably for most people, a leader of a party saying, look, 3 years is a long time, we've had a pandemic, all sorts of things have happened, we went into an election, we lost massively, so obviously we have to change the policies. These are quite reasonable, rational things for a leader of a party to say. I think it's particularly problematic for Keir Starmer if part of his sort of image problem is he's a bit slippery, he's the sort of London lawyer character who sort of ducks and dives a bit. And as I understand it, that is a bit of a specific brand problem for Keir Starmer, which is why saying, you don't stick with one position at all, you make lots of U-turns, will be problematic for him. But on this particular thing, he'll have a problem with the left of the Labour Party because tuition fees became an emblematic issue of betrayal of young people. With the wider public, I don't think that will necessarily be a huge issue for him.
I mean, he's becoming more Tony Blairish by the day. It's actually amazing to remember that he loyally served in a Corbyn shadow cabinet not that long ago. The interviews he gave yesterday, it was straight out of the Tony Blair playbook. He even tried to make a virtue of the fact that he'd U-turned, as showing how wise he was to respond to changes in facts on the ground. And this intervention on the NHS, which also happened yesterday, where he chose to go into a Conservative newspaper, talk about big reforms, talk about nothing is off the table in terms of reforming it, increasing the amount of private provision in the service. We have a Blairite leader of the opposition. Let's just be quite clear about that.
Oh, well, let's have a look at that headline since you've raised it. The Sunday Telegraph. Sir Keir Starmer, I will slash nonsense bureaucracy in the NHS. Well, I presume you agree with that, don't you, Scott?
Well, I agree with that one point. In terms of
that's fair enough. I'll come back to you just a second on the rest of it. Well, I'm sure you're good. Yes, I will come back to you on that. But do you agree with that? Slashing nonsense bureaucracy in the NHS?
Well, I think it's been interesting since the last 13 years have seen multiple reorganisations of the NHS and how things are commissioned. Again, last year, we saw the introduction of more change to that. And I think that, there is bureaucracy within the NHS. Of course there is. It's a massive organisation. But what really matters and what the government are failing on at the moment is that patients or staff do not feel safe at work, do not feel safe when they're waiting 16 hours in the queue to get into A&E. I think that's the focus that Keir is trying to get to, is that we need to change our NHS and we need to make sure that the NHS is there for us when we get into difficulty and that we have the staff in those jobs in the future.
Well, that's not what Sharon Graham thinks, the General Secretary of Unite Union. UK Labour can and must make the right choices on our broken economy in the NHS. The NHS is in crisis because of the government's deliberate and dangerous political choice to systematically cut the service and suppress workers. She goes on to say UK Labour's key message now should be that it will reverse those cuts so the NHS can truly get back on its feet, not that it will drive through yet another round of disruptive reform. Do you agree with her, or do you agree with Keir Starmer?
Well, I think that, I have my own view of this. And I think,
what is it?
But my view is that we absolutely have to see change very radically. And actually, I think that less should be spoken about what our position is and more should be spoken about what Rishi Sunak is going to do about this. He's currently in power.
But Sir Keir Starmer's talking about it. He's doing articles in the paper, so he wants to talk about it. And what I'm trying to get is what is your...
No, I think we do have policy.
You don't have a policy on the NHS or indeed anything else.
We absolutely do. And what we're setting forward is how we can get more doctors, more nurses, more midwives, more dentists into the NHS, delivering the care that patients need, and also prioritising patients' voice within the system. That is a very good question and one that will be fully costed in our fully costed manifesto.
Well, we heard that under Corbyn and that didn't transpire either.
Well, Scott Benhaji, you say that Labour hasn't got a plan, but in fact it was your Conservative colleague Edward Lee, I think, who last week said at least Labour has got a plan on the NHS rather than what the government was proposing.
Well, Sir Edward may have seen it, but Olivia hasn't, I haven't, and nobody else in politics has. Can I just answer points about Keir Starmer more broadly? This is somebody who ran to the left of Jeremy Corbyn during the leadership contest. He was wedded to his shadow cabinet and his project for years and years. And I'm afraid now the mask has slipped. We've seen U-turn after U-turn after U-turn. Now on scrapping tuition fees, on scrapping universal credit, he was in favour, now he wasn't. He was in favour of restoring free movement, now he's not anymore. He wanted to
nationalise utilities,
with
all of the things that Keir Starmer is saying.
To do anymore.
But you agree with everything that Keir Starmer has done?
Well, the point here is one of principle, one of transparency, and one of how genuine Keir Starmer is, because he ran to win the leadership on a left-wing platform to get people on board in the Labour Party, and now he's abandoned those pledges. That's his credibility.
Is that a problem with his credibility?
I think that Keir has been very clear. You know, what's more clear than writing in a Sunday Telegraph or a piece for a newspaper? Do you know what I mean? And setting out your views on the NHS. I think that, you know, it is clear that the world is very different from 2020. But, you know, there is going to be a debate within the Labour Party about our policies going forward. And, you know, Keir is leading that at the moment. But we will see what the genuine issues are at the next election, which will be around the NHS. It will be around the economy. And actually, Labour are the only party coming forward with policies like the 28 billion for green.
Well, let me just show you. We'll get the Daily Mail. Health experts hit out at Labour plan to let patients refer themselves for treatment without seeing GP first. Call this a cure for NHS secure. This follows on from West Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, saying people could self-diagnose and that you could actually dismantle the GP service as it is currently set up in private practices.
I understand those concerns. I think that's perfectly fine to kind of make that argument because, you know, GPs do play such a fundamental role within our system.
So you don't
However, when you look at something like women's health, it currently takes 7 years to get a diagnosis of endometriosis because women's pain is often massively underestimated by, and gatekeeping can be a big problem of that. So I think that actually in some cases it makes sense for people to be able to go and see a gynaecologist to get that sorted.
That was very weird. That idea of self-referring. I think Keir Starmer yesterday said that if you have internal bleeding, you should be able to skip the GP stage and go straight to a specialist. And have no idea what he meant by that.
Well,
but I do think it's important.
There was a correction that said it would be blood in the toilet.
But it's important we don't let the Tories off the hook here. I mean, I can understand why Scott wants to talk about Keir Starmer.
Absolutely.
But the reality is, 13 years into a Tory government, the NHS is in a worse situation than it has been all along. And I hope, I mean, I think we all have to hope that there is a chance, weirdly, that actually it takes the Labour Party and it takes the Labour government to actually reform the NHS because the Tories are so terrified
well, that's
of it.
an interesting point.
The Tories are so terrified of touching this sacred cow that they, for 13 years, haven't actually addressed it.
I love the idea that there's a sort of a Nixon in China moment where you need Labour to reform the NHS, which politically might very well be true. But again, it's just one of these situations where two things can be true at the same time. I mean, it can be underfunded and you can have a situation where neither party wants to be honest about the cost and also the fact that money isn't enough because actually you need structural changes and neither party wants to be honest about actually the scale of disruption that will cause. Labour doesn't want to be honest about getting the private sector involved because that will aggravate the left too much. The Conservatives don't want to own their 13-year legacy under which the NHS has fallen to its knees. You know, so we're stuck and we probably will need a change of government.
But let me, on that point, on Freddie's point, I mean, Keir Starmer said the NHS should not be off limits, treated as a shrine rather than a service. It might take the Labour Party to do what the Conservatives would like to do but can't.
Well, if you look at the NHS in Wales, which is Labour-controlled, I think you will see it's far worse than England on many of the key metrics.
Well,
so
we haven't got the metrics here, but take up the point.
Would be a magical cure for the NHS.
Take up the point that he could do what other Conservative politicians haven't been able to when it comes to reform of the NHS, if that's what's desirable.
Well, those comments from Sir Keir were actually quite encouraging. I agreed with much of what he said within that. It's clear the NHS needs huge reform. This Conservative government has poured billions and billions of pounds into the NHS. We gave it an extra 40 billion last year. We have a record number of doctors, a record number of nurses, but the problems the pandemic has created is not just the UK, let's be honest, it's health economies in the whole of the Western world are under huge pressure. Private primarily because of COVID, but the longer-term issues about structural reform within the NHS, on social care, on GPs, etc. We cannot avoid those questions.
Right.
Whether or not it's a Conservative or Labour government after the last general election, somebody is going to have to grapple with this very sensitive issue.
And just to point out that actually it's true, more money has gone into the NHS, but the rate of increase is far lower than it was pre-2010 over the 12 years of Conservatives being in government.
But the proportion of the UK public spending going to the NHS has vastly increased. Let's not forget, people are paying more tax than they ever have before.
Do you know what's really
the idea that we
interesting?
can squeeze more and more tax out of people to give to the NHS, I'm afraid, is not going to happen.
Would you like to see
use the money we have far more efficiently?
Would you like to see
That's what
taxes
it
to
comes
go
down
up to increase the rate of spending and as a proportion of GDP in the health service?
I think that it's been very interesting seeing the various statistics which have come out in the early part of this year around death rates, people living with illnesses for longer, and the fact that we don't focus on prevention. And that's what we need the NHS to do. And I think that is what Ciara's getting at, is that we need a more preventative approach so that will make people's health better, but also save money. And what we hear from the Conservatives is that we're putting more money in to a failing system, people are waiting longer, and the outcomes are not good. That needs to change.
He also said he would see an increase in private provision in order to clear the waiting list.
Because they've gotten so
now,
bad.
quite sensibly, in my opinion, going after votes in southern England, in affluent seats, which is where he's going to pick up more seats, and he is able to be braver on the NHS than the Tories are. I think that's a political fact.
Let's have a look at this in the Daily Telegraph and talk about protests. Police to get new powers to shut down protests amid fight-back against disruptive tactics. The new powers will mean police can require protests to take place on pavements and take action by removing demonstrators if they refuse. They're going to broaden the legal definition of serious disruption using an amendment to the Public Order Bill. What do you make of it, Raphael?
Well, look, first of all, causing serious disruption is already against the law. And intuitively, I'm quite wary of anything that touches on civil rights, civil liberties, protest, when it is obviously done to target a very specific situation. And the test I would always apply is, what would this law look like, not in the hands of a present government? Obviously, Conservative MPs would trust their government to use these powers correctly, and they would want to be generous to the police and say we give the police the benefit of the doubt how they use these powers. What would this law look like in the hands of the worst kind of government? Are you actually criminalising the intent to look a bit dodgy on your way to a protest? And as I understand from reading the amendment, that's very much the direction in which it's going. So given that a lot of what they're talking about is already against the law, the idea of just putting down an amendment to say, let's just let the police go on suspicion against people we don't like the look of to score a political point, feels like me a bad way to legislate in this particular area.
Scott?
I don't think that's the case at all. What we have seen over a number of years now are hard left-wing fruitcakes gluing themselves to bridges, gluing themselves to trains, gluing themselves to road, and stopping 99% of a tax-paying public getting to work and going about their daily business. On the very road outside this studio, we've had ambulances unable to get to hospital with ill patients inside because of the disruptive, highly inappropriate protests these people have carried out. It is not supported by the vast majority of public. We need to give the police the flexibility and the powers to stop these protests before they are carried out.
Olivia?
We will, if I can just make this point,
yeah, go on.
Lawful, legal protests will always take place in this country, but that is very different from gluing yourself to a road and preventing millions of people in this country getting to work on a
Exactly,
morning.
you're changing the goalposts on what is legal. I always make the case, my member of staff often drives her bike round here to get to work. She's got a bike lock. Is she going to be stopped by police going into work if there's a protest and asked why has she got a bike lock in her bag?
That's ridiculous, of course not.
But you say that's ridiculous,
Olivia,
but look
may I
at
ask
the
you a question?
legislation that
Do
you're
you
bringing
support
forward.
people being able to glue themselves to roads and ambulances not being able to get to a hospital?
Of course I don't
well, that's
support
what this bill is designed to address.
Hospital. But what I do support is free speech and people being able to say, actually, I'm not going to stand for this and I want my voice to be heard because the political system isn't hearing us. I think that it's absolutely right that people should have the right to protest for things that they believe in, whether that is a library being closed or it is, the climate emergency, people should be able to take to the streets and show their...
And they'll be able to.
Well, let me just show you, Scott, these pictures. This is Just Stop Oil on, I think, what they call a slow march or a slow protest. And this is the sort of thing that could fall under the jurisdiction of these additional powers the government would like to attach to the Public Order Bill. What's wrong with that protest?
Well, for a bit of context, this is the same organisation who caused millions of pounds worth of damage in London, and they've given hundreds of thousands of pounds to Keir Starmer. So is it any wonder Labour don't support?
Well, that's your party political thing. But what's wrong with slow marching?
Nothing's wrong with slow marching.
Well,
if I can finish, in an appropriate context. So if the police have been warned in advance a slow march about any topic is going to take place, roads can be closed off and those protests can proceed. What is entirely different, though, is an unplanned protest hundreds of yards away from an A&E, preventing ambulances taking critically ill patients to hospital.
Look, I think most people probably do agree with Scott. They are unbelievably irritating, and we did a documentary...
Well, even more than irritating, I suppose.
And dangerous. We did a documentary with Extinction Rebellion, and a lot of those protesters are very privileged and highly educated and have a very different worldview to the people whose lives they're interrupting every day. However, you've still, in the end, got to choose whether you want to live in a country that allows and supports protests. So as annoying as it is, and although all of our instincts might be to just shut it down, don't let them, reluctantly, I do think we have to allow it.
And the police have the powers already to disrupt...
Well, there are certainly powers under the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. It's just you didn't get, when I say you, I mean the Conservatives, didn't get the elements of locking on in there.
Yeah, I just think it's completely natural for a party in power to think that they are being very reasonable in accruing new powers to themselves. And it's also quite natural for the opposition to say these are terribly draconian powers. But if the situation was reversed and there was a Labour government that was instituting this legislation, I have no doubt at all that Scott would be sitting there going, this is typical left Stalinism. This is status. They just can't wait to give police more powers to kind of clamp down on freedom of expression and free speech. Of course, that's what he would be saying.
And is that why you're smiling? Is that why you're smiling away there, Scott?
No, I genuinely don't. I'd like to think, as an MP, party politics aside, I look at individual issues one by one. That's why I've rebelled against the government in the past, for example. I think Freddie's right. The vast majority of people would support these measures coming forward from the government. Let's be honest, we are not banning protests at all. Any claims to the contrary are, quite frankly, absolutely outrageous and ridiculous. But we have to be balanced, we have to be proportionate. The police have asked for additional clarification and flexibility to negotiate these protests.
And that's exactly what the government are providing. Passing a new law.
Well, let's have a look at this headline, The Guardian. They see a slippery slope, clearly. UK risks being listed as a human rights abuser, NGO warns. Human Rights Watch warns UK has very short window to reverse legislation, including restrictions on the right to protest. Well, we've talked about that to some extent, but they are also including some of the other pieces of legislation, the Elections Bill on voter identification, the Borders and Nationalities Bill making the channel crossings illegal because of the way that migrants and asylum seekers actually get here. Is that what's happening here?
No, and it doesn't surprise me to see The Guardian take the side of hard left,
they might believe it.
fanatics
they might believe it, of course, Scott.
against the ordinary, hard-working people of the British public. I'm afraid that's more ludicrous headlines, as you'd expect.
Is that what it is? Are they ludicrous?
I don't think they are ludicrous, and I think people should be really concerned about the rights that are at risk from this government. Don't forget we've got the Bill of Rights still being tumbled around in the background that would undermine our human rights globally, and I think that people will be looking in from abroad and with quite a lot of disgust.
So would you like to see a Labour government repeal those laws?
Well, I think that we need to look at the laws and how they're working out, the ones that have been passed. But
is there one that you'd like to see reversed?
I mean, I certainly think that the noisy protest element was ridiculous, and I'm glad that the Lords picked that out. But I think that
the Elections Bill on voter ID?
Absolutely. I think that is my view personally, is that there is such a restriction.
You have to be able to ask also a question of organisations like Human Rights Watch, I think, because where were they for 3 years of pandemic? Where were the right to assemble, the right to a family life? Last time I checked, these are human rights. very little, not a peep from organisations like those. And suddenly, when it's about gluing yourself to the road for Extinction Rebellion, they're very noisy. So I share your scepticism about that. But still, on balance, I do think we have to be careful about the authoritarian drift.
And on that, it's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for being here in the studio. We've got more Politics Live tomorrow at 12:15. I'll be here with a new set of guests. You can watch it on BBC Two or the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.